International Media TV, television that listens to you.
My name is Kevin Williams. I grew up here in an area of San Francisco called Bayview Hunters Point, and I am going to speak about my experience as a compliance officer here in San Francisco for the Redevelopment Agency during the 70s, during the time in which I participated in the enforcement of a federal regulation called Section 3 of the Housing and Urban Development Act. And my story begins fresh out of college, out of San Francisco State University, which I had no idea that I would end up enforcing certain programs that were related to the government. After I graduated, I took a vacation to go to my hometown in the state of Louisiana, and got a call from my mother, Ruth Williams, who was a community leader here in San Francisco, to cut my vacation short about a week and come back to San Francisco and go to work to pay off some of the school loans. And I started off with the Redevelopment Agency under the CETA program, that is the Comprehensive Employment Training Act. And under that program, as an engineering aide, it was a sort of an introduction to construction related work. At the time, the Bayview Hunters Point area was undergoing a major site improvement project funded activity that was through the Housing and Urban Development Act. And so the Redevelopment Agency had considered me for working along with some of the engineers in those departments, and found that there was this new concept, and they had a shortage in another department called affirmative action. I didn't know what affirmative action was. So this new concept of affirmative action entailed enforcement of the Section 3 of the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968, and a series of implementation procedures. Now, in the backdrop of all of this, I did know that many community leaders in the Bayview Hunters Point, including my mother, who had been appointed by Mayor Joseph Alioto at the time to the Model Cities Commission. She had become the vice president and had been actively engaged in bringing back the first monies for housing from Washington, D.C. A group of women, 5 very prominent women from Hunters Point, they were called the Big Five, were able to obtain funding following the repeal of Proposition 14. Proposition 14 was found to be unconstitutional. It was a proposition that allowed people in public housing to be evicted for a variety of reasons, most of which were that they were poor. And when that proposition was repealed, they appeared before the Senate Appropriations Committee. They worked with Senator Burton, John Burton, and a number of other politicians that were sympathetic to poor people in Hunters Point, and were able to bring back tens of millions of dollars. Little did I know that my involvement following college would bring me right into being both from the community, being educated in San Francisco and having attended all the public schools here, and what I would actually be working in implementing the very programs through the Housing and Urban Development that would entail employment of low-income persons in what was referred to as the strategic marketplace, the metropolitan strategic place in Bayview Hunters Point. And Section 3, as well as some of the other programmatic forces that were in play, entail working with the unions, as well as the building trades and the model city. The model city was defined as the Bayview Hunters Point leadership, who developed what was called a memorandum of agreement. The memorandum of agreement was the tie-in to the HUD-funded programs relative to housing. Section 3 actually applies to the grantees' receipt of federal money, and as a condition of receiving the federal funds, the municipality, that being the city that receives the funding, was required to have implementing rules and procedures for carrying out the programmatic mandate of the federal government. Oftentimes, it was very difficult to figure out exactly what the regulations intended for the city to do, in that there were conflicting purposes running concurrent with the programmatic focus or the objective of getting the programs in to work in the best interests of those it was intended to serve. First and foremost, the unions had an objective that was different than labor. Labor had an objective that was different than the local hiring, where the poor people were. But the overall principle behind Section 3 that we attempted to enforce, and I thought we did a very good job of that, was that due to the massive amount of construction activity that occurred at the time, there was a great deal of inconvenience for the residents. There was the repaving of streets, curbs, and gutters, actual new sewage systems for the basic building blocks for the housing that would later come. So with that activity, there would, be a grading and paving, heavy equipment use. So it developed job opportunities that heretofore didn't exist. So therefore, the community, in its infinite wisdom, worked along with the city through the redevelopment agency and the unions to develop an apprenticeship opportunity foundation whereby placements were made. It was a reservoir for labor and training. So the component for training needed to match the union regulations, which was sometimes ominous to the extent that you had to meet the union requirements in order to get the placement of the apprentice or the new worker on the job. Then the other component was the model city. At that time, the way that the program worked was the community had what was called a joint housing committee, where the community played an active role along with the redevelopment component, which was the role that I played as an affirmative action officer in terms of enforcing what the rules said. But we also had to have the community participate in going around to the various job sites to ensure that at least on a craft-by-craft basis, 50% of the workforce came from the model city area. And at that time, we had a very clear boundary for establishing what the Section 3 placement or the Section 3 resident would be as eligible for participation in the program. So the boundaries were north to Evans Avenue, which is now Cesar Chavez, south to Geneva Avenue, east to the Bayshore Freeway, and west to the Bay. So we had parameters. That's just one component of Section 3. The other had to do with local business opportunities. If there was a hardware store or a construction supply business or some ancillary business located in the Section 3 area, we would encourage the contractor to buy materials and other products and supplies from the immediate area. And the other area had to do with when contractors failed to comply. We would initially have what is called a pre-bid and a pre-construction and a pre-award meeting with them. And in this meeting, we would cover a broad spectrum of requirements. And we would hand them physically what the legislation said about it, the implementing rules and regulations and guidelines, so that they would be thoroughly familiar with the goals and objectives of the program. After that, we would have the engineers explain to them that compliance with the reporting mechanism, so that we would be able to track not only the placement but also wages under the Davis-Bacon Act. So there would be two components. One is the advent of tracking of placements. The other would be tracking of compliance maintenance. So with that being the case, we were quite successful at being able to report progress or the lack thereof in terms of where we were headed. From my understanding to date, these guidelines under Section 3 have not been updated since 1994. I was 22 years old when I began in its infancy, actually. This was in 1963, and I came in around 73, so the program was only about a decade old. So since that time, we found that they've been implemented in different ways, in various ways, that some of which worked, other aspects of it didn't work. What we found to be most significant in terms of the implementation of Section 3 of the Housing and Urban Development Act is the enforcement component, because we're dealing with construction contractors that were very tough to deal with. They would know the rules, so you had to know the rules just as well, if not better than they did. And we would conduct what is called show cause hearings. And if you look at the Section 3 guidelines today, you see the word good cause. Well, we took it to another level, but within the programmatic focus of good cause, we utilize show cause, and that is when a contractor had not met the guidelines or the goals, they would either have to explain that they've either met the goals or why they failed to meet the target goals. If they failed to meet the goals, we would let them know up front that they could be debarred or we could withhold progress payments. We found most of our success was in explaining to these contractors that if no affirmative action, no contract. If you fail to meet the goals and you cannot explain why, we will hold your progress payment until you found the wisdom to meet the programmatic mandate. And in many instances, they did only when the purse strings, we tug at the purse strings of the contractor. We did something I thought that was monumental in the 70s, and that was on a principled basis. Strategically, it was effective to educate the project managers, inspectors, and department managers that the components of Section 3 affirmative action driven programs was just as fundamental as the building of the project itself. It was a part of the concrete and the mortar and the steel, so that the Section 3 enforcement mechanism was understood to be a part and parcel to the actual work, because in many instances the enforcement aspect was seen as something on the side that was secondary to the project. With all of the time constraints that engineers had, the project managers would often come to our department or our division and say, could you just look the other way, that is not as important as actually getting the building or the site improvement or the commercial building built. And our resounding answer was consistently no. The affirmative action Section 3 requirements were just as fundamental as the project building of itself, the actual building of itself. So they had to see the programmatic guidelines, rules, and regulations as integrated into the project. And that was my experience with Section 3 of the Housing and Urban Development Act. First, as an affirmative action assistant, starting with a government program called CETA, Comprehensive Employment Training Act, where I got the start. And by the age 25, I was affirmative action specialist for Hunters Point India Basin projects. After that, I ended up with the City and County of San Francisco Human Rights Commission in 1985, where I became an affirmative action assistant, then a contract compliance officer 1, and subsequently to the highest level in city government for the Human Rights Commission of San Francisco, senior contract compliance officer. And so in the area of compliance, I have been involved in most of my adult life, or at least 2/3 of my adult life. But I believe that it took a combination of the community during the time I started out in model cities. It took the unions working together along with the community, and it took government from the vantage point I came from, tying all three together. I believe that is what made it work. I believe it worked so well, the Memorandum of Understanding of 1970, it worked so well that they discontinued it. It was something that was never broken, but somewhere, somehow, there was a decision that it needed to be fixed, and it was fixed and became non-existent. And that is my story.